Hello and welcome. My name is Madeline Longoria Garcia, and these are our other stories. Today's episode is just you and me, just solo little check-in conversation, and I'm going to be continuing to share my family's story of ending up in the United States, how they moved about, as I shared in the first episode of this season. My dad's side of the family emigrated from Tlaxcala, Mexico to California. My mom's side of the family is also from Mexico, but a very different area. And we'll dive into that a little bit through this episode. But I also thought that this might be a great opportunity to do a little bit of a check-in, talk about what's happened so far and what's coming. We are just over halfway through this season, and we've heard from some great people, some people who have some incredible stories of their families moving around the world, moving to the United States, leaving the United States, all of these things. And I feel like it's been a really, for me personally, having these conversations with people who I know to varying degrees has been really insightful. And I don't know, I hope that this maybe encourages you as somebody listening to this to think about these different stories and how they are woven into our lives too, and into the lives of the people who we encounter every day. And maybe we can take something from this to get a little bit more curious, not just with the strangers in our lives, but also with our own families, and start having these conversations if you haven't had them already, and asking the questions if you haven't asked them already, because I know that there is a lot of lost information out there because we're simply not having the conversations or asking the questions. Yeah, this is one of my goals, I think specifically with this season at least, is to encourage you listeners to have those conversations with your elders, to ask them what they remember. And even if they don't have a migration story per se, but maybe they just moved from one city to another within their nation, what prompted that move? What made them stay? Why did they leave? Why did they maybe not stay? Why did they go back to their hometown or home city? And really trying to get into the thought processes of these people in our lives versus solely knowing the logistical details and the timeline. I think those are the pieces that a lot of folks are missing, of knowing the why, or knowing the humanness behind that decision. And, we'll probably experience some of this thought process through other seasons too, in different ways, and we'll see what happens. So, like I said, we are just over halfway through this season. This is episode 7 of season 1. And we still have a few more amazing conversations coming down the pipeline. I am very excited to share these with you all. These are just, yes, some incredible humans in my life. And we're going to wrap it up. We're going to wrap the season up with a little bit longer of an episode. And the reason why it's a little bit longer is because we're actually tacking on at the end some practices and exercises that you can go through and use these tools to allow yourself to kind of process different things that are coming up. A lot of what we're discussing in this season, people are sharing their feelings of feeling like an outsider, feeling like they have to embrace different ways of being that may not come so naturally to them, feeling as though they have to shed certain parts of them, or at least quiet them or hide them to a certain degree in order to assimilate and integrate and feel accepted and feel like they can actually progress professionally and personally, because they're in an environment that is a little bit different and foreign. And so, the end of this season, that last episode, we are providing some tools that you can use when maybe you start to feel these ways of not feeling like you belong, and how we can process that in our bodies. That's why the last episode will be a little bit longer, and we are sharing these tools through me being guided through the tools. So our guest for that episode will be guiding me through these practices and exercises. There will be some pauses in that because I am going through those movements and motions. So that's a little gift to you, and there's an extra gift added to that, but I'm not going to share that here. You have to listen to that episode at the end of the season to receive that gift. But it is very worthwhile. I promise you that. And I hope even just listening to that episode and all of the episodes of this season will be very worthwhile for you. Okay, so let's get into it. My mom's side of the family. I want to preface this by saying this story is one more generation further removed. So on my dad's side of the family, I am second generation born in the US. On my mom's side, I'm third generation born in the US. And that's also only partially true, and I'll explain that in a little bit. So because we have one more generation kind of removed from this process of coming to the United States from Mexico, there are fewer details that are known. And I think a lot of this is because, when I ask my family members these questions, a lot of the responses are, I never asked those questions, or I never thought about that, or I was too young to know or to remember XYZ. So I do want to share there are fewer details that I can provide you from my mom's side of the family and their story of coming to the United States. But really, it's a story of ending up in Los Angeles, is what I want to say. And Los Angeles is where I was born and raised. I lived there until I left for college. And it is a place, again, on my mom's side, there are multiple generations of my mom's family who have been born and raised in that city. So with that, I'm going to start with my grandfather's side of the family. His name was Manuel, and I actually never had the opportunity to meet him. He and my grandmother had split before I was born, and he was not the best father figure, is what I'll say. He didn't have the best relationship with his kids, including my mom. And so he died when I was very young, and I never had the opportunity to meet him. I do remember going to his funeral. I don't remember a lot of the details of that, but because I was so young. But my grandfather Manuel, he was actually from Texas originally. And his family, that lineage, is a great example of the border crossed us. We didn't cross the border. Because as far as we know, all of the family history leads us to Texas. And that's it. And so when Texas, that area was part of Mexico, when it was part of Spain, when it was its own indigenous autonomous land, that is where the family is from. All I really know is he was from the area of Brownsville in Texas. And he would have been born, I believe, in the late 1920s. Yes, I believe in 1927. And at that point, Texas had been a U.S. state since 1845, so a couple of generations before him. And if you are at all interested in learning about how Texas became a U.S. state, I definitely encourage you to look into that from multiple perspectives as well. because I think what we learn in US history books and textbooks is definitely skewed to paint a little bit of a cleaner picture than the reality of what played out. So I've read and watched and listened to accounts of this piece of history from a couple of different perspectives, and I think that that's what I would encourage folks to do as well. But Texas was annexed from Mexico in the late 1830s, I believe, or 1840s. And it was an independent land, I guess, for a short period of time, and then it became part of the United States. And a lot of that actually was the post-war era in Mexico after Mexican independence from Spain, and they were trying to attract commerce and build a stronger economy. And so there was this encouragement to have US settlers come into certain areas of Mexico to bring in that economic activity. Over the years, these people wanted to be separate from Mexico, not be a part of Mexico. And then there was this pretty aggressive attack, essentially, from the settlers who were in that area of Mexico, Texas. So that's just some historical context there. And yes, my grandfather's family, that's all we know, is that the border crossed them. The border changed multiple times. That land was, quote unquote, owned by multiple different countries throughout the family's history of being there. So he was born and raised in Texas, born in 1927, and he actually enlisted in the military when he was 16 years old. He lied to enlist in the military at that age, and he went to go fight in World War II. He was in the Navy. So he enlisted in the Navy at 16, went to fight in World War II. The details aren't very clear, but eventually when he got back from that war, he ended up going to Los Angeles instead of staying in Texas. And the story goes that he wanted to get away from his hometown, from his family, and there was some fracturing there. And so he was not interested in staying in his hometown and with his family. So he left for Los Angeles. My grandfather was actually in 3 different, arms of the military. So he was in the Navy during World War II. And then I believe he was in the Air Force, and he went and fought in the Korean War in the Air Force. And then he was also in the Army. Yeah, it's kind of crazy to me that he was involved in 3 different arms of the military and went and fought in 2 different wars. I mean, was 16 years old in fighting in World War II. I know that back then, mental health was not spoken about, especially not with folks in the military. But I know just from the stories I've heard, the things I know about him is that he definitely suffered from PTSD. And I assume a couple of other things as well. So he ends up in Los Angeles, and that's where he meets my grandmother, Josefina. And I'll come back to that in a little bit, but let's back up now to my grandmother's side of the family and how they ended up in Los Angeles. So it was her parents, my great-grandparents, who migrated from Mexico to the United States. And they came separately, so they didn't know each other. Well, they knew of each other in Mexico. They both were living and grew up in Tepic, which is the capital city of Nayarit. So my great-grandparents knew of each other, but they weren't friends, they weren't close, definitely weren't dating, they weren't married to each other in Mexico, and they both ended up coming to the United States separately and re-meeting each other in Los Angeles. So there's a couple of different threads here, and I'm going to try to make this as clear and uncomplicated as I can. But let's start with my great-grandfather. So my great-grandfather, Jose Torres, was actually a soldier in the Mexican army. And he was a soldier during the Mexican Revolution, which went from 1910 to 1920. He was based, again, in Tepic, in Nayarit. So during the Mexican Revolution, it came to a point where it was known that the Mexican army was losing ground. The revolutionaries were winning. They were the ones who had an upper hand. And because my great-grandfather Jose was part of the Mexican army, part of the government, it became dangerous for him to be in Mexico. And so he decided to leave Mexico and he fled to Los Angeles. And that's really as much as I know. He fled to Los Angeles and started a life there. Around the same time, my great-grandmother, Luisa, she was also, again, living in Tepic. She had 2 sisters and a brother. And one of her sisters was married to a man who owned a local newspaper. And he actually, the 2 of them, started to receive threats on their lives because of the newspaper and the things that he was publishing. Again, this was during the revolution. No matter what, if you were publishing something that put one side in a favorable light compared to the other, there was going to be somebody who was upset. So he started receiving death threats, he and his wife, my great-grandmother's sister, Lola, and it actually ended up being the whole family left. Lola, and then my great-grandmother, Luisa, Lola's husband, their other sister, Domitila, and then their mother, so my great-great-grandmother. They all left Tepic. Interestingly, the son, my great-grandmother's brother, he stayed in Mexico. And I'm not really sure why. When I asked my mom about this, she said that she was under the impression that he was kind of an outcast from the family and must have just decided that he was going to stay there while everybody else left. So they leave Mexico. And again, this is where details are unclear. I don't know exactly what this relationship was, but somehow they either knew someone or someone in the family owned this boarding house in Arizona. I don't know exactly where in Arizona, but what a boarding house is basically a place where you can rent a space for a couple of days, a couple of weeks, a month or 2. You're not renting long term, but it's not a hotel. So there was this connection to a boarding house in Arizona, and that's where my family first went. So my great-great-grandmother, her 3 daughters, and 1 son-in-law went to this boarding house in Arizona. Unclear on the details of how long they stayed there, but they stayed there for a period of time and then ended up going to Los Angeles. Do not know why they decided to go to Los Angeles. Again, these are the questions that haven't been answered. The whys, right? The trying to understand the thought processes and the motivations behind why these actions were taken. So they end up in Los Angeles, and then Luisa, my great-grandmother, and Jose, my great-grandfather, somehow meet each other. Again, they knew of each other in Tepic, but they didn't have any sort of relationship. My assumption, because this is how immigrant communities operate really everywhere, is that you find out, oh, there are other people from my hometown in this place, or that's what brings you to that city because there are these connections to a hometown in Mexico or whatever home nation, and people find each other and you build a community there of folks who you are somewhat familiar with, or at least have something in common with each other, right? So this is kind of the assumption, is that they just met because of that commonality of both being from Nayarit in Mexico and ending up in Los Angeles. Again, I don't really know the details of all of this, but they get married, they have a relationship, they have kids. So this is where my grandmother comes in. She was the eldest child, my grandma Josefina, and then she has 2 younger brothers and 2 younger sisters. So there's 5 of them. They are all born and raised in Los Angeles. They are all born at home. The home where my grandmother was born doesn't exist anymore. Los Angeles, as you can imagine, has changed a lot since 1921, which is when my grandma was born. And that home doesn't exist anymore, but it is that home where it was located. It is now close to where the downtown post office or Union Station now exists. That's generally the area where it was. So kind of cool to just know too that in that part of Los Angeles is where my grandmother was born and her siblings. My great grandparents, Jose and Luisa, they established their lives in Los Angeles with their 5 children. And I don't really know where quote unquote the money came from. There is maybe a guess that because my great grandfather Jose had served in the Mexican army, that maybe he had some payout from there, some money from that role, that he was able to establish a life in Los Angeles and establish a business. And so this is what he did, is he owned small local grocery stores, and he owned either 2 or 3. I know for certain at least 2, but my mom thinks that there were 3. And the one that she remembers the most was what is in modern day Arts District of Los Angeles. Back then, it is not what it is today. It used to be a trucking community, so very industrial, these huge lots with, big trucks that were coming from all over the nation, ending up there, and a big trucker community. So people who were just passing through, staying for a few nights and continuing on, or people who were based in Los Angeles. And that is who this grocery store served. That's the community that this grocery store served. That was the business that my grandfather had, or my great grandfather had. Back in Nayarit, I will share also my great grandmother. She was a teacher. She was a school teacher. She did not continue doing that when she was in the United States, especially once having children. She was a stay-at-home mom, and that was her job, and that was her role. Full-time stay-at-home mom, 5 kids. It's a lot of kids to take care of. So they had this grocery store, though. And my great-grandfather also he owned rentals, like a home to rent out. I'm not clear on how many he had. I know that it was a couple. I know that he had a duplex at one point too that was rented out, and then a couple of single family homes that he rented out. Another one of the grocery stores was also near the Coliseum in Los Angeles, and they also owned a home right near there. Again, I think that there was a third one. I'm not exactly sure where that one was. So that's what my family did. That's how they established their lives in Los Angeles. That's how they established the family in Los Angeles. And eventually, my family ended up settling in the Boyle Heights neighborhood. So they had lived kind of all over Los Angeles, in what's now the downtown area and Arts District area, near the Coliseum, and then what's now Boyle Heights. And that home was actually that family home was on Dickerson Street or something like that, Dickerson Lane, something along those lines. That street I know still exists. Boyle Heights is a super well-known Latino neighborhood in Los Angeles. And so, yeah, my family just has these deep roots, over 100 years worth, basically, of roots to Los Angeles and to these Latino communities in the city. yeah, I mean, this is where, and then this is just where my grandmother grew up. And she and her siblings, my two tios and my two tias, they apparently were quite social and would go to parties and other gatherings around the city. And that actually is how my grandparents met, was at a party. Eventually, they got married and had their children, their three kids, including my mom. Something else I want to bring up here is, when I ask my mom about if she ever had these conversations with her mom or her grandparents about what it was like to move to the United States, to grow up in Los Angeles, what kind of memories they had. She didn't have a lot of those conversations with them, but there are these few key pieces that I think are fun insights into Los Angeles and Los Angeles history too. So, a couple of things are that my mom remembers her grandfather, my great grandfather, was always very proud of being Mexican. This is the great grandfather who served in the military in Mexico during the revolution. And so he always felt very proud of being Mexican. My mom doesn't think that her grandparents, my great grandparents, ever became full US citizens. She knows that they had green cards, and she knows that they kept their Mexican citizenship, which is the main reason why she doesn't think that they became US citizens. But she remembers that they would go back to Mexico relatively regularly for the times to visit family and spend time in Nayarit. And they always maintained that connection there, that very strong connection, and that like love and pride of their home nation. They also were bilingual. And this is something else too of they obviously had access to an education that allowed them to be bilingual. They spoke Spanish and English. My grandmother, my grandparents, they were bilingual. So my grandmother grew up in a bilingual household speaking Spanish and English. My grandmother went to school. She didn't go to a traditional university. What it's described as is a business college, like a business school, to get some sort of certificate, basically to become a secretary. In the 40s, my grandmother had access to an education that allowed her to have an office job in the 40s and 50s and 60s until she retired. And her siblings had access to the same education as well. Her two brothers, my Tío Carlos and Tío Humberto, they both enlisted in the Navy. And something that's very interesting here is, and a big piece of LA history is, they actually were involved in the Zoot Suit riots in Los Angeles. And what that is, it was a racially charged attack on people who wore Zoot Suits. And the communities who wore Zoot Suits at the time were Mexican Americans, Filipino Americans, and Black Americans. And the perpetrators of this were actually servicemen in Los Angeles, so the Navy. And I find it really interesting that my two uncles, who were a part of the Navy, were attacked by their own fellow servicemen because of the color of their skin. And this is an interesting piece of Los Angeles history I also encourage folks to look into and read up on, because it shifted the dynamics quite a bit. And I think, gosh, how ironic is it that my two uncles are serving this nation, and their own fellow servicemen, their comrades, their colleagues, the people who they are supposed to be fighting alongside, are the people who are attacking them. So they were involved in the Zoot Suit riots. They were attacked during that time. I bring this up because I know that for my grandmother and her siblings, there was this encouragement from their parents, from my great grandparents, to embrace American identity. Even though they were still so proud of being Mexican, they encouraged their children to first and foremost identify as being part of the United States and being American. And they did that. I think joining the US military is a pretty perfect example of embracing this nation and identifying with this nation primarily. Yeah, I feel like that piece is kind of interesting. This weird dynamic of we are Mexican, our parents are encouraging us to embrace US culture and identity. Our parents are still very proud of being from Mexico. They feel this allegiance to Mexico, but we're going to join the US military, enlist in the Navy, and then our own people in the Navy are attacking us because of who we are and beating us up because of who we are. Other pieces of, what I know of my grandparents growing up or my grandmother growing up in Los Angeles is that, they lived on the east side, right? They lived in downtown Boyle Heights near the Coliseum, and they would still take these day trips out to the beach. Even today, to get out to the beach from that side of Los Angeles is a little bit of a trek. So imagine back then in the 30s and 40s, what that was like. And my grandmother would share that Sunset Boulevard, they would take Sunset Boulevard to get out to the beach. And Sunset Boulevard was a dirt road. And that seems crazy for me to picture and envision, but Sunset Boulevard was a dirt road back then. And that's the road that they would take to get out to the beach. And it was lined with orange groves on both sides. It was not lined with all of these buildings and development and shopping areas and everything that it is today. That was gone. That didn't exist yet. It was orange groves. It was farmland. Just like thinking about these things and what this huge city of Los Angeles, which today is such a huge sprawling city, back then it was farmland to get out to the coast. It seems wild to me. And my mom says that she remembers having these conversations with her mom and grandparents and asking them what Los Angeles was like back then. And it was obviously not as developed as what it is today. And they remember going back to Tepic to visit, and that as the capital city of Nayarit, they were just like, oh, it was so much more built up and established and developed. There was so much more going on there compared to Los Angeles. And I have never been to Tepic. I've never been to the state of Nayarit. I would love to visit one day, but it seems really crazy to me that Los Angeles would be the smaller, less developed city of the two. But again, this was 100 years ago. So yeah, so there was always this relationship with Mexico on this side of the family, going back to visit. My mom went to Tepic several times as a child visiting, and they were all, again, bilingual. And my mom, her first language was Spanish, but as soon as she started going to school, the whole family switched to English. And it wasn't just her parents, but her grandparents also switched to English. So everybody just, again, embracing this kind of US identity and how that comes through in language. And today, when I have this conversation with my mom, she feels this almost regret of not maintaining her Spanish, but at the same time realizing it was because everyone around her switched to English. And so she didn't even really have the opportunity to maintain her Spanish. It was always English as soon as she was of school age. So a theme, I think, through all of the stories that we've heard of language and losing language, or trying to maintain that, or changing the way that you speak to fit in too, and whether that's intentional or just something that happens. That's always, I don't know, I find language to be a really interesting piece in a lot of these stories that we are hearing from folks. So I feel like on my mom's side of the family, it is a story of leaving because of war, because of the Mexican Revolution, because of this threat to their safety and well-being. And then it becomes this story of establishing themselves in Los Angeles and building this multi-generational foundation in that city. And I wish I could see that city through my great-grandparents' eyes. I wish I could know what they did and what it was like, and why they chose these certain places to live. That side of my family, has these deep roots in Los Angeles. So it was my great-grandparents, my grandmother, my mom, and me, 4 generations of living in Los Angeles. What has changed? So much change and shifting in that city. Yeah, I just wonder, I don't know. It seems like what a crazy thing to think about, being in that same place for that long. 100 years at this point, over 100 years at this point. My grandmother was born in 1921. She was born in Los Angeles. So my great grandparents knew each other, met each other sometime in the 1910s, got married, and started their family. Yeah, a lot of deep roots there, a lot of history there. And that's kind of just where my family's story ends on my mom's side. A lot of my mom's side of the family is still in the greater Los Angeles area. Some of the family still lives in one of the homes that my great grandparents bought however many years and decades ago. Another one of the homes was just sold out of the family in the last year. That was kind of like a really sad moment, kind of a a grief that I felt, even though I didn't personally spend a lot of time in that home growing up. But knowing that it had been in the family for so long and was now being sold, that was sad. But yeah, I mean, life happens, things change, right? It's a very different, again, older history of being in the United States. This side of the family too, especially my grandmother, her side of the family had a lot more Spanish European blood than indigenous connection and blood. The features you can see in my family on that side, more Spanish European features than on my dad's side of the family. So that is the story of my mom's side of the family coming to the United States. I was born and raised in Los Angeles. I am one of the very few on my mom's side of the family who have left Los Angeles. And maybe that's just, where our family is meant to be for a bit longer. But I do have a lot of fond memories of growing up in that city. And whenever I go back, it does feel almost surreal whenever I pass by the places that I know my grandmother or great grandparents went to, or where they, had a home. My mom can point out the general area of where, the first grocery store in the arts district and where their home was on Mateo Street. And I'll go to Union Station and think about somewhere in this area is where my family had a home at one point, and just kind of wondering what that looked like beforehand, before Union Station existed. And oh gosh, and passing by Lincoln High School, that's the high school that my grandmother graduated from. That's a whole, always like such a surreal feeling of, damn, my grandma graduated from that school. Anytime passing by that school. Yeah, so pretty interesting history, I think, in Los Angeles. I wish we had more details. I wish we knew a little bit more, but that is kind of what we know. Yeah, like I said, a lot of my family on my mom's side is still based in the greater Los Angeles area. Some of them are still in those areas where my great grandparents built a life for themselves and their children. And my grandmother, I feel like the reason why I didn't have the opportunity to have a lot of these conversations with my grandmother is because she died when I was 16 years old. I was going into my senior year of high school. And I think I was just too young. I wasn't thinking about these things. I wasn't thinking about asking those types of questions. She was a huge part of my life growing up. She was my grandmother, and I don't think I really had the perspective of seeing her as somebody other than my grandma. And I think that was because she was such a key person in my childhood growing up. She was like a third parent. My parents split up and divorced when I was quite young, and we lived with my grandmother growing up with my mom. And my grandma, yeah, took on a very parental role. My mom worked full time. And so whenever we were with my mom, it was my grandmother primarily who was picking us up from school. It was my grandma taking us to do back to school shopping. I remember going to this store that no longer exists in Los Angeles, but everybody knew my grandma there. And she would take us shopping for new clothes, for, getting new shoes every school year, getting our new school shoes. That is the role that she played in my life. She was, yeah, a third parent. And that is how I always saw her, right? This guardian in my life versus a person who isn't your parental figure or your grandparent. So I just don't think I really had the opportunity to see her outside of that role and understand that she had lived a whole other life or many other lives before she was my grandma. But she passed away when I was quite young, when I was 16, and I didn't know my grandfather. Like I said at the beginning of this episode, he died when I was very young, and I only remember a little bit of his funeral, but it was a full-on military funeral. And I actually don't, those are the pieces that I don't remember, but my sister remembers, and she tells me, she's like, "Oh no, I remember the guns going off, the music, the flag being laid over the coffin, and then the flag being folded up and handed over and to the family, to our family." Yeah, it was just a full-on military funeral for my grandfather. And he is buried in a pretty large veterans cemetery in Los Angeles. Yeah, um, that's my family story. Like I said earlier, I feel like it's kind of a story of Los Angeles more than anything. That is how they ended up in LA. And so that's the other piece of my family's history of moving to the United States. And again, don't forget though, on my grandfather's side, the border crossed them. They didn't cross the border. And I feel like that's a really important piece for us to remember, because there are a lot of people who live in this nation today who had the border cross them probably a couple of times and land exchanging hands by whatever powers that were at play at the time, multiple times. So keep that in mind, and thank you for listening. My name is Madeline Longoria Garcia. These are our other stories. You can stream this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Antenna Pod, and wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also watch this podcast on Spotify and YouTube. I ask that if you are enjoying this podcast, please leave a comment, review us, rate us. We have a few more episodes coming this season. I look forward to sharing them with you. Have a great day.